Why did Rome expend so many resources to quash this particular revolt? And if their efforts were so successful, given the numbers that they had and the experience that they had, why was there a second revolt 60 years later?
So I think that the answer to the first question is a little bit complicated as well. I think that the Romans believed in the early 60s that that the number of people kind of in the rejectionist camp were a relatively small number of people who could be controlled by the local governor, the procurator, and the auxiliaries under him. And then when that didn't work, they sent down Cestius from Antioch in Syria with a kind of large army. And again, I think that they thought that that would intimidate the rebels into surrender or negotiated settlement. But as a general rule of thumb, I think the massacre of thousands of civilians in Jerusalem and just outside of Jerusalem in 66 by the soldiers of the procurator crossed the line and made it almost impossible for many people who are kind of in between the rejectionists and then the people who were, solidly on the Roman side. It made it impossible for them to stay where they were. And when I've talked about this before in other contexts, I've just asked people to think about what the consequences of those massacres really were, because of course these are men, women, and children that lots of people would have been related to, brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. And so I think that that was really the event that kind of that set it all off. And afterward, it was difficult for people to go back. And when they roughed up the army of Cestius Gallus, then the prestige of the Emperor Nero himself was in play. And Nero wasn't known for his aggressive military policies. And after the fire in Rome, his own position was sort of in play. And I think that Nero thought that he really had to do something about it. So he sent out a kind of seasoned commander, Vespasian, with a large army. And in 68, one of the Roman commanders, again up in the area around Germany, had enough of Nero and revolted, and Nero ended up committing suicide, and that kind of opened up a competition for his replacement. And Vespasian had the support of the soldiers that he was commanding in the Galilee and Judea, and then also legions in Syria and Egypt. So Vespasian came from a relatively humble background. So, winning the war against the rebellious Jews became kind of the justification for Vespasian and his family to sort of grab at the throne in Rome. And so I think that explains why it is that they thought that they really had to crush this rebellion. And finally, this was a rebellion that took place within an area that nominally the Romans claimed to control. The other rebellions, the rebellions that I was talking about before, were sort of on the close to the periphery. People from outside of the Roman Empire, the Romans weren't as concerned about that, but a successful nationalist rebellion from within the borders of the Roman Empire were probably a different story.
And the second part of the question, if they were so successful and used so many resources, why 60 years later do we see another revolt?
The reason I think for that is that the Romans were not as successful in suppressing this revolt as they believed. Vespasian and his sons who succeeded him, Titus and Domitian, thought that when they had destroyed the temple and eradicated the sacrificial part of the religion from their point of view, that essentially that was the end of the story, that this was over. But what I argue in my book is that, unsurprisingly, they didn't get, as it were, kind of the essence of this other way of understanding history and the world, which was based on, as I said before, a book. And that's something that I believe that other people who have written about the Jewish revolt have not really appreciated in a satisfactory way that book with the hundreds of commandments, with the history, was something really unique. So another factor I would want to add is that, you know, the destruction of the Second Temple was a precedented event. It was a terrible event, but it was precedented because, of course, the First Temple had also been destroyed. So I think that the Romans misjudged the significance of their victory over the Jews and the siege of Jerusalem. They did not snuff out this nationalist ideology. So inevitably that led, especially because after 66, after 70, the Romans went out of their way to kind of militarize Judea, and that only aggravated relations.